Hi everyone, and welcome to this week's episode of Recovery Talk. So, for this week, I wanted to talk about something that keeps coming up with clients, but also comes up a lot when I ask you guys on Instagram, whether on letsrecover.co.uk Instagram or whether on my Molly Lee account, about like podcast questions, topics you want me to cover, and that is walking and step counting. I have done episodes covering walking prior, so the one on exercise and recovery, and also the episode about lower level movement. Both of these touch upon walking, but I want to make one that's more specifically about walking and also about step counting. So the thing with walking is very often walking kind of gets a bit of a pass in eating disorder treatment, right? Very commonly I hear people who say, oh, my psychologist or doctor or whatsoever said, I can't exercise, but I'm allowed to walk. Or I'm allowed to do X minutes of walking a day or X amount of steps. And here's the problem with an eating disorder, right? If your doctor tells you, oh, okay, you can do maximum, let's say maximum 10,000 steps a day, then very often the eating disorder will interpret that as is I need to do minimum 10,000 steps a day. That is what I need to do, right? When actually it's just an absolute maximum. Same thing goes when people are given times, for instance, oh, you can do maximum 30 minutes of walking a day. Again, just an example. Very often that means, oh, I need to do 30 minutes of walking a day, right? And even doing 29 minutes can seem like, This is the thing with an eating disorder. It's when it comes to steps, it sees the maximum as a minimum, but when it comes to food, it sees the minimum as a maximum. I think very often when doctors set goals, for example, say, okay, maximum 10,000 steps a day, I think that they have good intentions. They're trying to get someone to reduce their walking, right? Maybe they had someone who would be compulsively walking tons and tons and tons, and then they're actually trying to reduce it, right? So instead of 20,000 steps, they're doing 10,000 steps, right? So I understand the intentions behind it. But of course, the problem is that there is still that attachment to the counting, attachment to numbers, attachment to measuring, and that is not always helpful. And because realistically what will very often happen is that the person with an eating disorder, even though they've been told this is the maximum, they will see it as I need to do this, right? So if they've been given the green light to walk, let's say upwards 10,000 steps a day, they're going to see it as they need to get 10,000 steps in. And I'm using this 10,000 number because that's a number that keeps coming up again and again, because once upon a time, someone decided 10,000 steps, yeah, that's a good amount during the day, so let's just set that as some arbitrary goal, right? In the same way with the 2,000 calorie myth, right, which I've covered a little bit in the past, that people just kind of decided on a number that's not really reflective of how much people eat. Most people eat way more than 2,000 calories a day. That's been shown over and over. And equally with steps, there is not like one number that is right for everyone, If you're in eating disorder recovery, 10,000 steps, that is a lot of movement. And in recovery, it's so important to rest as much as possible. So physically, there are no physical benefits to walking in recovery. There's a lot of potential physical damages to it. And also the physical bit aside, mentally, if it is compulsive, if it is anxiety driven, if it's rigid, it's probably not the healthiest thing to do in recovery. Because very often with walking, doctors will kind of be like, or therapists whatsoever, they'll very often be like, well, it's just walking, right? It's not like you're running a marathon or like heavily lifting weights. So I guess it should be fine then, right? You're just going for a little walk. But again, if it is, even though I would argue that compulsive walking can physically have a lot of harmful consequences, right? But even if you put that aside, whether it's harmful or not physically, it doesn't really matter as long as it's harmful mentally, right? So if you're noticing that this is compulsive, this is driven by an emphasis on numbers, by you feel rigid and the thought of cancelling it feels terrifying, then chances are the healthiest thing you can do is actually to skip that walk, even if you have been quote unquote allowed by your treatment professionals. So I understand not everyone who listens to this episode will be counting steps. Some may be, I guess, more focused on walking a certain amount or just having to walk every day without necessarily counting the amount. So kind of take what fits and applies here, because I am kind of covering two things in one episode. But overall, a good indicator that you have a problem with walking is if the thought of canceling that walk is giving you anxiety and discomfort. And another little experiment that I sometimes do with clients is if they, for instance, say they've been allowed a 15-minute walk by their doctor every day, right? If they feel anxious by the prospect of spending part of that 15 minutes sitting down on the bench. So imagine you go for a walk and maybe you're just walking for 5 minutes and then you spend 5 minutes sitting down on the bench and then 5 minutes walking back, right? If you find that actually sitting down during your walk and spending the walking time sitting instead of walking, if you find that anxiety provoking, that's also a little bit of an indicator that it is somehow the eating disorder driven, right? Because very often what the eating disorder will do is that it will see this as like this holy moment during the day where you are allowed to engage in the walking behavior. And if there's any disruptions towards that, then eating disorder will act out. Very often people will say, well, my walking is not disordered. It is actually something I really enjoy doing. I enjoy getting out of the house. I enjoy getting some fresh air, just getting a change in scenery, right? And I completely understand that. But what I would here encourage you to do is to do kind of what I just suggested with sitting down on a bench, right? Or sitting down somewhere. So if you, for instance, have been quote unquote allowed a 30-minute walk a day, if you instead see that as 30-minute outside time and you spend some time of that sitting down on a bench, and if you notice that sitting down is giving you a lot of anxiety, that just shows that there is something to work on here. And also if the thought of cancelling that walk is just really giving you anxiety, then that's not really an indicator that it's a healthy relationship to walking, right? Because people who like walking, think of someone who's completely non-disordered, they like walking. If they notice that it's like pouring down rain, or they're kind of tired, or they got something else coming up, they will cancel that walk, right? But if you are scheduling your day to fit in, for the walks to fit in, if you're scheduling your day around those walks, that is a bit of a red flag. Because what I sometimes hear with people with eating disorders is that they will do the walk even though they're busy, even though they are in pain, even though they're feeling unwell, even though the weather is really bad, they will still do the walk. And if they don't, they feel really, really bad. Very often people measure how they feel in the moment as, an indicator whether something is disordered or not, right? And this can sometimes be a bit tricky when it comes to exercise such as walking, because it can very well be that when someone is actually walking, they feel quite peaceful, they're kind of enjoying it, maybe even like listening to some music, having a good time, right? So it could be in the moment, it feels really nice to walk, right? So using that as an indicator as to whether or not your walking is disordered may not be the best thing, because it could very well be that when you're walking, you're feeling pretty calm. You're not necessarily like, super, rigid about it in the moment, right? But instead, use how you feel if plans change, if you can't do the walk, if you skip the walk. How much anxiety does that give you? Use that as an indicator instead of how you feel in the moment when you're walking. How do you feel when you're not walking? How do you feel when it doesn't go to plan? And I think it's so important to be aware and acknowledge that several truths can exist at once, right? You can be someone who really enjoys walking. You can be someone who finds that a nice, peaceful thing, and also be someone who has a disordered relationship to it, right? These things can exist at once. There are some people whose walking is just 100% eating disorder. It's not really an activity they even enjoy, and they just kind of have to just completely quit it. I've had clients who walking is just 100% disordered, and then I have other clients who they actually like, it's something they kind of enjoy. It's something that they don't really, they think it's a nice activity that they want to maintain for the rest of their lives, right? But I want to remind you this: if you're someone who actually really enjoys walking, wouldn't that be an argument to really heal your relationship with walking? Because don't you want your walking to be something fun and non-disordered? Don't you want to go for walks without the eating disorder on your shoulder? So very often people in recovery use the fact that they enjoy walking as a reason not to challenge it, right? They're thinking, well, I enjoy walking, so it's not disordered, right? Something can be enjoyable and have disordered elements at the same time. That should just give you further motivation to heal it, because if walking is important to you, you want it to be something that is not, tethered by the eating disorder. But equally, if you're someone who actually don't really enjoy walking, you don't have to walk, right? You don't have to walk. And this goes with exercise in general, because sometimes when I talk about, exercise and eating disorder, and also, getting back into movement and all of these things, I also want to remind you that you don't necessarily have to do that, right? Like, it's okay not to be someone who loves exercise. I just don't really enjoy any kind of movement. I can sometimes like going for a little walk and all these things, but it's not really something I enjoy or want to do every single day. And that is completely fine. I have to do some stuff for my physiotherapy because I have issues with my joints and literally my whole body, because I have some kind of hypermobility disorder. We don't know yet what kind of hypermobility disorder it is. We just know that my knees and hips are not doing what they're supposed to do. This is non-eating disorder related, by the way. It's something that is a genetic thing I've had pretty much my whole life, but it's started to get bad lately. So I basically have to do certain things for my physiotherapy, and I'm just, every time I'm doing it, I'm just like, this is the most boring thing ever. Why do people enjoy this? Why do people enjoy exercise? Why do people enjoy these things? I'm literally like dreading it, right? And I want to remind you, if you are like me, who just don't really find, and not really someone who loves exercise or movement, or like rather, catch the bus rather than walking, it's fine. It's completely fine. I'm never going to be someone who lives at the gym. I'm never going to be someone who is super excited to do my stupid physiotherapy program. And if I can find, this is an interesting thing, and this is a big difference. If I can find a reason to skip it, I will. Whether it's a little bit bad, I'm not going to do it today. I'm not going to go to the gym. I'm going to do my physiotherapy today. Oh, if I can postpone my physiotherapy a bit, I will do it, right? It's very interesting because with eating disorders, you often see the complete opposite. A person with an eating disorder will find any reason not to postpone it, right? So the gym can be closed and they'll still manage, okay, no, then I'll just do it at home, right? While someone without an eating disorder who's not that interested in exercise, like for example me, if something comes up, instead of my physio, I will 100%, skip it if I can. And another thing that's interesting I see with my with my movement regime that I've had to do with my physiotherapist, the ways that I will work on shortening that that session, the way that I will try and do as little as possible, as quickly as possible. Whilst when I see with clients or anyone struggling with movement, very often they will try and push it. So if they have, for instance, you can go to the gym, they will try and push it so they do more and more, longer and longer, right? Whilst for me, it will be the opposite. If I find a reason to skip something or do less of it, I will, right? So again, a little bit as a side note, but I thought that could maybe just be an interesting indicator, because I do feel like I'm someone who has a very relaxed relationship with movement and don't really love it. And I feel like that can maybe be good to hear if there's someone who is like that and maybe feels shame around that, because there's sometimes people who are like, I feel like I should love exercise. I see all of these people on Instagram who go from, eating disorder to being like bodybuilders and running marathons. Why is that not me, right? And it's fine if it's not. And it's fine if walking is not your thing, right? I know this is also a little bit of a side note, but I see a lot of, and I've spoken about this before, a lot of eating disorder charities, they kind of follow the same, walking is okay approach, where they do like eating disorder walks or walk for, doing all of these events related to walking. I just don't really vibe with it, I just don't really vibe with it, because I work with people whose walking is distorted and where that is something that is difficult for them. And I just think that giving walking some kind of free pass and saying that all of the things we talk about with exercise and movement in recovery just somehow doesn't apply to walking, I don't really think that is good. I think it's doing people a big disservice, right? Because I will talk to people who have stopped going to the gym or stopped on the other kinds of compulsive movement, but their walking is like their holy moment during the day. And it's interesting because very often with clients, they'll be so hesitant to even mention it because it's almost like this precious thing they don't want me to take away from them. And that just shows how important it is to work with it, right? That just shows that this must be worked with. So I would actually say the more resistance you feel listening to this episode, the more you notice your eating disorder is throwing reasons as to why this doesn't apply to you, why your relationship with walking is fine because of this and that and this and that. The more resistance you feel here, the more that could be an indicator that this is actually something that should be worked with, right? So take that resistance as an indicator that there's something to work on and investigate. Ask yourself, how do you feel when your walk is cancelled? How do you feel, or if it comes up a situation that would make cancelling your walk the most reasonable thing to do? Do you feel strong resistance towards that? Imagine you're planning on doing an evening walk, but then someone comes over to visit. Will you sit there just kind of wishing that they left so you can go for your walk, right? That's a very, very red flag. Would you imagine if you had someone over and they stayed late, would you still go for your walk after, like a late night walk after, just to make sure you got your walk in? Also a red flag. And these behaviors, you may think, oh, that's innocent, right? But do you want to spend your life being that person who is scheduling your day around walks, who get anxiety by the thought of don't going for the walk, right? Or do you want to be the person who would go for a walk whenever you want to, if you want to, and do it because it's something you want to do rather than something you feel like there's a voice in your head forcing you to do it? And this 10,000 step thing, I'm not going to go too much in depth about why that's kind of like a little bit of a BS thing, you know? But just remember, everyone is different, right? And nothing bad is going to happen if you don't walk 10,000 steps a day or 5,000 or whatever your allowance is, right? If anything, you're just going to have benefits by having some rest. I always say that if your exercise is driven by compulsion, by rigidity, by self-hatred, by anxiety, etc., then probably the healthiest thing you can do is to skip that exercise. And that does include walking. It includes all forms of movement, even movement that often go under the radar because it's less intense, which I spoke about in the lower level compulsive movement episode. In that episode, I was also covering just moving around in general, the inability to sit still, etc., etc. So do check that out if you haven't already, if you feel that applies to you. And now I want to talk a bit about step counting, because this is a huge thing for some people. And one of the main ways that I work when I work with clients when it comes to focusing on steps, and of course, when this is individual, right? I do work differently with from person to person. I work with a specific, different tailored approach, right? So this will be quite generalized, but one of the main ways, main approaches that I use is complicating the process of counting the steps in the first place. And with steps, it's a huge advantage in a way because steps is something you kind of need a tool to count them, right? With calories, sometimes that can be a bit more tricky because that almost goes automated, right? So even if you don't count calories, you may know how many calories something have, right? With steps, actually, if you are not using some kind of app to count, chances are you're not going to go and count every single step you take. I mean, that will be pretty complicated. So one of the first things I do when I work with clients who struggle with compulsive step counting is to complicate that process, right? And that essentially could mean deleting the app, you know, big thing. If you delete the app and get away from your phone, that complicates the process, right? But then again, some people may find that the app still counts. You know, some phones have like, it's just automated. It's just there. You can't really delete it. It's just kind of built in on the phone, right? And if that is the case, I tend to, again, same approach, complicate it, right? So for example, if your step counting thing is on your phone health app, then what you can do is you can hide this app, you know, for even if you can't remove it, you can hide it. So for instance, put it in a different folder on your phone. If you have an iPhone, like hide it in some folder, essentially making it harder for you to access the app. And then another thing that could be very good is to make it harder, even if the app is automatically counting your steps on your phone, put it somewhere, for instance, in your backpack instead, where you know it's not going to reliably count the steps, right? Or even leave your phone at home. If you're going to going for a walk and you know that, you know, you're not really going to need your phone, actually leaving it at home could be a good idea. And I know that can be annoying, especially if you're like listening to music or something and you need your phone. But then again, it's just to practice, you know, just to kind of get a break from that app, you know, get a break from the step count. Or if you need a phone for some reason when you're going out, maybe you could bring a different phone. Maybe you can borrow someone else's phone just for the time. Maybe you can bring a watch instead so that you have somewhere else to look at the time that's not your phone, right? Again, think creatively here. How can you complicate your access to that app? And my suggestions would be trying your best to remove the app to any way you can, turn off certain functions if you can. I know every phone is different, but usually you can at least hide it in some way, put it in a different map, and then think when you are bringing your phone, put it somewhere where you know it's not going to reliably count your steps, right? And this can be so scary for people because very often when I see with people eating disorders that they have this hyper focus that, I need the steps to be counted because if not, they don't count, right? And this in itself just shows that there is something to work on here, right? Get comfortable with not knowing how many steps you're walking. And also be aware that more steps does not mean better, right? Very often the eating disorder will kind of try and create this like superiority thing. If you're moving more, you're a better person. There is no inherent value in being the more active person. It doesn't make you a better, more superior human being. So again, just to kind of summarize once again, complicating your access to the step count. If you have a specific step counter, if you have a smartwatch, don't use that. Don't use these tools. I know it's tempting. I know you'll find all kind of reasons as to why you should hold on to these tools. But the truth is the eating disorder are using these as torture tools. I know you can tell yourself, oh, it's just curiosity. I'm just curious how many steps I walked, right? But again, you are having attachment to a specific amount of numbers. More steps are not better. More minutes spent walking is not better. In recovery, you need rest. And also after recovery, you need rest. Do you want the way that you're moving around in the world, whether you're walking or whatsoever, do you want that to be, so saturated by obsession with numbers? Imagine you're traveling somewhere, you're on holiday and you are sightseeing and you're having a fun day. Do you want it to be like, oh shit, let me check how many steps I did? Do you want that to be your impulse? And don't underestimate the impact of walking on your recovery, right? I very often see people who will walk and the walking is just compulsive. It is just like constantly being pushed to be longer and longer. They will take longer routes, etc., etc. And it is not necessarily, just because it's often given a green light doesn't necessarily mean that it's a green light for you, right? And I also sometimes see that people will explain that when they have days when they're walking a lot, even though that is seen as like a kind of lower level form of movement, still that walking can be enough to really trigger something in the brain a bit, right? I'll very often talk with clients who've had a day where they're walking around a lot. Maybe they went shopping to the mall, or maybe they went on a festival, something like that, where they were walking a lot, being a lot on their feet, and they noticed that movement actually triggered something because it basically created a little bit of a energy deficit, and that energy deficit could be enough to kind of flip on a switch a bit, right? So that's also something to be aware of, right? Be aware of how walking, what does it trigger in you, right? And remember, several truths can exist at once. You can feel like walking is a nice activity that you enjoy doing, giving you a bit of a break from everything, and also acknowledge that there are disordered elements. Get comfortable with rest. Get comfortable with having a day where you don't do any walking at all. And in recovery, the more rest, the better. You need it mentally and physically. And equally what I said with the step count is about, removing the easy access to the tool that measures the step. Same thing would go if you're someone who maybe don't count your steps, but you look at the time, for instance, I can walk. Maybe you've been given some kind of allowance of like 30 minutes a day of walking is fine. And then you will have maybe like a stopwatch or a time where you look at how long you're walking. Also think of what are some ways to remove that. This can be a bit of a tricky one because you don't want to be like, okay, well, I'm allowed 30-minute walking a day. I'm not going to look at the time. So I'm just going to walk however much I want to, and then you maybe end up doing a lot more, right? So this is something to be mindful of. But overall, what are some ways to complicate my easy access to the tools that I use to measure this? And what are some ways for me to do that without that result of that being that I'm just going to move more, right? Because we want to move, we don't want that to be the outcome, right? We don't want it to be, oh, I'm not counting my steps, so then I can just walk a lot because I don't, it doesn't matter. So then you just end up walking a lot more than 10,000 steps. We don't want that to be the outcome either. What I often see is that the reason people would walk, let's say 10,000 steps, is because they set that as some kind of goal that they need to hit, right? And if they haven't hit it, they like, oh shit, they panic and then find ways to hit it. I heard people saying they're walking at late at night when they're super tired. I heard people saying they're walking even like around their own, like in their home, just to get the steps in. This is disordered behavior. This is not how you want your relationship to walking to be like, right? And equally, if you're someone who don't enjoy walking at all, it's not an activity you have to engage in. Just because you've been given some kind of allowance to do it doesn't mean that you have to do it, right? And the more resistance you feel towards not doing it, the more it's an indicator that this is something that needs to be worked on. Okay, guys, I hope you enjoyed this episode. And now I'm going to answer a listener question. This question is from Instagram, from the letsrecover.co.uk ask box, that I often open for listener question and topic requests for the podcast. And the question is pretty straightforward. It is it okay to eat pizza every day for weeks on end if that's a huge craving? And the answer to that is yes. It is so common in recovery to have one specific craving, and that very specific craving is very often something you have been banning yourself from, right? And what happens then in recovery, you're allowing yourself to eat it, and then it becomes very exciting and you kind of want it all the time, right? And the mistake people do here is that they think, oh shit, this just shows that I'm addicted to this food. That means that I should be a bit careful, I can't have it all the time, right? And that just fuels the obsession even more. But then if you instead just allow yourself to eat this food as much as you want, having completely unlimited, unrestricted access to it, that actually is a way to normalize the food. And that actually, ironically, will also make you eventually not want it all the time. So for example, with pizza, if you are banning yourself from pizza, you're kind of putting it a bit on a pedestal. And if you, the more you try to restrict and control and be like, oh, I don't want to be pizza addicted, the higher up on the pedestal the pizza goes, right? If you just allow yourself to have pizza completely unrestricted and implementing, I would say also throughout the day if you can, then you realize it just becomes pizza, right? And you might even become a bit tired of it. So it's completely okay. Maybe you wake up in the morning and you have some leftover pizza for breakfast and then you have pizza for dinner, right? It's completely fine. It's the best way to become at peace with the food is just to allow yourself unrestricted access to it. Whenever I have clients who have a specific food that they are constantly craving or really like, that it's just a food that they always want, I tell them, it's okay, eat them, right? You're not going to necessarily feel like that for the rest of your life. For example, chocolate is a good example. A lot of times people have this with chocolate where they kind of want chocolate all the time, but then when they eat it, they're so scared of losing control somehow. So then they ban themselves from it and they're like, okay, I can eat chocolate, but only a bit, only during the night, only during this time or that time, or only during that day, right? And then of course, chocolate just becomes more and more exciting, right? And then when I have clients who are like that, I actually tend to say, okay, well, now let's implement it as much as we absolutely can throughout the day. Let's start, you wake up and you have some chocolate with your coffee and then you have some chocolate for dessert. Implementing it throughout is the best way to get peace with it, right? I know I did an episode with Danny. I think we spoke a bit about this, or maybe we didn't talk about it in an episode, but I know I've had some kind of thing with Danny Van Kay, and she was talking about how she had the same thing with lasagna, where she would want lasagna all the time and she would just eat lasagna. And then one day she was kind of like, oh shit, I'm really fed up by lasagna now. And I've had that with so many foods in recovery as well, where I start, it's so exciting, I want to eat it all the time, I think I'm just going to be addicted to it, oh my god, and then of course the eating disorder urges will come to be like, oh yeah, this is something you should be careful around, this is something you need to control yourself around, right? But actually doing the opposite and allowing yourself free, unrestricted access to it in the exact quantities that you want, whenever you want, is actually usually the most effective way to go ahead, right? It's completely normal to have a food that you want all the time, crave all the time, and you are allowed to eat it, and you're allowed to eat it unrestricted, exactly when and how much you want. Okay, guys, thank you for listening. I hope you enjoyed this episode, and I look forward to talking with you guys next week.